I'm here with Professor Christine Whitehead, who has just been speaking at the Oxford Planning Law Conference. My name is Adrian Penfold, and I've been chairing that particular session. We've had a fascinating session with some very interesting questions at the end of it. The focus was on barriers to entry to the housing market, and we covered a wide area. Well, beyond that, I think, looking at many issues. I want to pick up on some of those issues and ask you one or two questions and perhaps allow you to expand a bit on some of what you've been talking about this afternoon. I want to start by something that Nick Wakely said at one of our sessions, or one of his themes I picked up from the session this morning, which I don't think you heard, but
yes, I did.
You did hear,
yeah.
Sorry, which seemed to suggest that he had new to his role at the HCA, shortly to be renamed Housing England. Seemed to be thinking very hard and long about urban extensions and new towns and new villages as one of the ways forward on housing delivery. And I put that together with your figures, which I hadn't heard before, which was something like 50% of all planning permissions in London were on sites of, I think it was 1,500 units or more, and 5% of the delivery was on such sites. So there seems to be a bit of a mismatch there, or a challenge, we say, for Nick in terms of his strategy going forward. What do you make of that?
I think that everybody has the belief that it would be desirable to go back to a version of the old-style new town, where basically you bought up land which was very close to agricultural value, and you could get upfront funding, and then you built it. You owned the land, and so you got the income, and also you got the value capture automatically in that process. Canary Wharf was something of that sort, except that they forgot to include in it powers to do the transportation. So it took an extra 10 years because the transport had to be brought in a different way and funding. I think it's a model which worked extremely well. It worked extremely slowly. And I think this is the real problem. But we're not going on the whole for very large... I mean, the large site question is somewhat different. But in the main, when we've done this, new towns tend to be rather small. They tend to be rather like large estates, without very many facilities, etc., etc. So it's a very large commitment, and it's a very large commitment to not just the next generation, but the generation after that.
Yes.
And so I think there is, everything in the system makes it easy to stop things happening, but very, very difficult to get them to go at a reasonable rate. Now, in the context of a London thing, that all of these planning permissions are on these a lot are on these very large sites. This is partly simply regeneration. It was an industrial city 30 years ago, and it's not an industrial city now. But these are very, very difficult sites, and they require an enormous amount of upfront investment. And that process, I think that if we get to a point where we can actually calculate these figures for 2017 through to 2020, we might find that we were getting up to sort of 15% of them coming off the large sites.
Yes.
But it's just a very, very slow process.
I suppose the one thing that Canary Wharf and the new towns had in common was massive public sector intervention in various ways, whether it was through investment or deregulation or funding of infrastructure. I mean,
and even the allocation of jobs.
Yes, yes. And on those sites that you've been talking about, in the 50%, over 1,500 in London, but very few of those would have that level of public sector support or intervention.
Yeah. A lot of them are obviously, because they are regen sites, they are very badly used in the past and need an enormous amount of clearing and so on. They have accessibility problems because they are in London. They're not in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
Most of the new towns were either in the middle of nowhere or they were an extension into nowhere. And this is not what we're talking about in London. We're talking about really, really difficult sites. We did a study, and nobody can find it. I've been trying to get it, with Arup, about the beginning of one or other government, 20 years ago, say, of the 15 largest sites in London where nothing was happening and what would happen. And they were all cross boundaries. They crossed into 2 or 3 boroughs, and they were all extremely difficult sites. And I think you'll find that of those 15, 3 are now functioning. Not completely, any of them, but 3 are functioning. But the other 12 are still not functioning.
I suppose the difference now is that we've got a mayor, haven't we?
Yeah.
And it's part of the mayor's role to deal with some of those cross-boundary issues and with some of the larger sites.
It is indeed.
Could he be doing more?
He doesn't have an enormous amount. Obviously, basically at the present time, what he wants is devolved powers. What he's not going to get is significantly devolved powers unless the world is slightly different than I expect it to be, because the government's policy is to try and bring all the other devolved areas up to that sort of level. And also because London is a very good milch cow for the Treasury. So the idea, they're all pressing for, the business rate has been devolved with some good consequences and bad. But they're all pressing for stamp duty to be devolved. Well, stamp duty comes 85-90% from London. It's the Chancellor's favourite tax.
Yes.
Because nobody else is affected by it. So there are, I think that, an enormous amount of effort is going into devolution rather than into trying to make things work in the current environment. I'd like there to be devolution, but I think there are real barriers to that issue. What we were trying to do prior to this last election, in which we had a lot of traction, was to try to develop a program separate from a mainstream program, but with identifying new resources to do all these things, to maybe build 50,000 a year extra for mainly the post-student pre-child group, but it could include children, and it could also significantly include homeless, which was a really important part of what we did. And we had a lot of traction for this, and what we were basically asking the Secretary of State to do was to be the mayor, because they can't devolve the powers, but he can actually make the things work.
He could use.
And I think it's got to be that integration between the two to make it work. I don't think any mayor's going to find that they can do an enormous amount on their own.
We've talked about the large sites. What about, because we're looking at barriers to delivery, and the barriers for large developers are very different from barriers to smaller developers. And it looks like we're going to be, whatever happens, we're going to be reliant on those smaller sites and smaller developers for a large proportion of the numbers going forward. How do you see the barriers to those smaller developers, and what might we do to improve that situation?
I think that there are some small developers groups who are very politically powerful, and nearly all of the emphasis has gone on those people. So that, for instance, Croydon, which is very much in the forefront of this sort of thing, has identified 90 sites which they own themselves. I don't know what the number is. It might be 70, it might be 90, which they will let out at the same time to small developers, and they will promise them planning permission, and they can do it under a new PIP type arrangement, or they can do it another way, so that they get those sites. But the problem is that each site takes a lot of time for the planning department, and it may be producing 2 or 3 units.
Yes.
So that by the time they've done all this, they might get a couple of thousand units, but it's not a lot. The area where we're doing very little to help is the is the sort of, actually, the archetypal is the post-2009 developer, somebody who came into the market, probably not new, but in 2009, 2010, able to get rid of the back problem. Some of those are growing to the sort of 700, 1,000 a year type level.
Yes.
And what we need is a lot of them. We need a lot of people who are growing and expanding.
Do you think we need a more diverse market?
We need a more diverse market, and I think an awful lot of what is being done is to try and make that market a contractual market rather than a speculative market. So, Nick, in his role as HCA, is contracting
the speculative risk from those smaller developers.
But the problem with that is it really does tie you up in all of the public sector problems.
Of course,
in that context. So I think there is something to be said for trying to help these ones to develop. But I'm afraid that most of them have developed significantly, mainly because of Help to Buy and other government policies. And if those change, they may disappear.
Absolutely.
But we need a lot more developers who are producing 1,000 a year.
Indeed, I think that's a good note to finish on. I seem to be spending a lot of time saying thank you to you.
Sorry about that.
But I'm very happy to say it again. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you.